In the wake of our study of the Diebold AccuVote machine, other researchers got to do further studies of other Diebold machines and DREs from other manufacturers, and found a lot of other very alarming things about the security of these machines. The most significant of those studies was one commissioned in 2007 by California Secretary of State Deborah Bowen. Secretary Bowen decided to initiate a study of all of the electronic voting machines used in the state of California. And to do this, she brought in a team of researchers from all over the country who had experience analyzing voting systems. I was part of this team. I got to concentrate on part of the study looking at a new Diebold DRE, the AccuVote TSX model, as well as a Diebold optical scan machine and the back-end election system software that's used by election officials at the election office to distribute ballots and then tabulate votes from different machines. These efforts were much easier than our initial Princeton review because Secretary of State Bowen was able to use her authority to compel the voting machine manufacturers to turn over their source code for review. This meant that we didn't have to reverse engineer the machines from scratch. Instead, we had the blueprints to start with, as well as hands-on access to the machines. After working for several months, the teams produced reports about the source code, the documentation, and other aspects of these machines. Here's the set of reports produced, and I think you can see something about the volume of scholarship and problems and thoroughness that went into this project. The results were very interesting because we got to see for the first time how voting machines from several different manufacturers held up when reviewed in approximately the same way. And all three teams that studied systems from different manufacturers came to similar conclusions about the DREs. One team studied DREs from Hart InterCivic, and they found that these machines were also susceptible to malicious software silently changing votes with no evidence left behind of the fraud. In addition, they found that the Hart machines could leak information that would compromise the secret ballot. A team studying machines from Sequoia came to the same basic kinds of conclusions, that vote-stealing software and compromise of the secret ballot were both realistic threats. Our Diebold team also came to the same categories of conclusions. This resulted in Secretary of State Bowen decertifying the DREs from all three manufacturers. Jurisdictions in California would no longer be allowed to use them for most voters during forthcoming elections. Instead, jurisdictions would use other technologies like precinct count optical scan that, as we discussed in the last lecture, give significantly better security properties. There was another study later in 2007 commissioned by the Secretary of State of Ohio that looked at voting machines from some of these same manufacturers. Also a large-scale academic-based review. The Ohio study found, once again, similar kinds of problems. But one thing that's interesting is that when the same voting system was studied again and again, in this case, for instance, the Diebold machine that was studied initially by the Hopkins team with the leaked source code, then by the Princeton team I was a part of with our machine from the anonymous source, then in California, then again in Ohio. Each of these studies found even more problems than the one that preceded it, in addition to confirming the problems people already were aware of. This is one of the problems with doing source code review on software. You can never be sure you found all of the problems, and in a system as complex as any of these, there almost certainly are going to be more problems to be found. Each of these three voting systems was many hundreds of thousands of lines of code, plus in some cases an off-the-shelf operating system that was hundreds of thousands more. No commercial software in history of this complexity has ever been secure, so it would have been unprecedented if any of these voting machines was without problems. In the same time period, other academic teams did studies of other voting machines in addition to these major state-sponsored studies in California and Ohio. I don't have time to talk about very many of those today, but I do want to give you a sense for some of the more fun results that people found. One of those studies took place in the Netherlands, where the man you see here, Rob Honkrijp, took apart the machine used nationwide in his country. That was the Nidap ES3B. Rob led a team that did a thorough security analysis of the Nidap machine. They came up with a variety of really interesting findings. First of all, with just 1 minute alone with this machine, they could disassemble the machine, taking out a series of screws, pry out the ROM chip containing the voting software, and replace it with another chip containing malicious software that would steal the votes in the actual election. If that wasn't enough, they found that this machine was leaking information about the way people voted. And in a form that few people had thought to look at before. They found that if you took a radio receiver into the vicinity of the machine, say hidden somewhere in the polling place, you would see different radio emissions when someone was voting for one party versus another. This sequence shows radio spectrum received during casting 3 votes. Time here is moving from the top to the bottom. So each of these arrows is pointing at a row containing the radio spectrum during one vote. Now, all devices emit some radio waves, all electronics do, but in this case, the interesting thing is that it changes depending on the candidate. And the reasons for that were a little bit tricky, but it was still enough to compromise the secret ballot. After they had demonstrated that they could reprogram the machine to steal votes, the team in the Netherlands decided to have a little bit more fun. So they went on to reprogram it some more to make it play chess. All of these demonstrations added up to a thorough debunking of security claims from the manufacturer and the government. And as a result of this work, these electronic voting machines were banned in the Netherlands, which went back to balloting with paper. Inspired by the chess-playing Nidap machine, Ari Feldman and I, who took part in the Princeton-Diebold research together, decided several years later to have similar fun. We studied another kind of DRE called the Sequoia AVC Edge, and this machine had been in use in several states until other researchers had thoroughly debunked its security in other studies. Then several states sold them off, including Virginia, and a colleague of ours bought one government surplus that had been in use in Virginia and handed it over to Ari and me. We thought about what to do with it, but really most of the science had been done. We knew these machines were thoroughly insecure, and by this time there had been dozens of studies looking at the problems with DREs. But we decided anyway, because we were curious, to spend a weekend or two taking it apart and seeing what else we might do with it. So here's the inside of the machine. There are a couple of notable features. One, the processor chip in the bottom half there is a 486. That's the same chip that might have been in a desktop PC in the mid-90s. The second thing we noticed was this, the memory that stores the election software is a compact flash card, exactly the same thing that might be in a digital camera. Based on these facts, we knew it was going to be pretty simple to reprogram the machine to do other things. So what's the first thing that you reprogram a machine to do when you see something like this? Well, the answer that any of the nerds in the audience might tell you is exactly what we did, which is we ran Linux on it. The next thing we did was we made it run Doom, the 1990s era shootout. There was just one problem with this. You can see Ari has to turn his head 90 degrees in order to see. So that inspired the last and final software upgrade we did, and I think in doing so found the ultimate and best use for these thoroughly debunked government surplus DREs, and that is we converted it into a Pac-Man machine. How did we do this? Well, we went out and got this. This is the circuit board for an original 1981 Pac-Man machine. And on some of these chips, just like the chips in some of these voting machines, is the software for playing Pac-Man. Because computers can be reprogrammed, and one thing that they can be programmed to do is simulate another kind of computer. And so we took the software out of the Pac-Man machine and emulated a machine inside the Sequoia AVC Edge. That machine you see on the screen is running the original 1980s Pac-Man software. Pac-Man on the AVC Edge ended up being a huge hit at the annual Electronic Voting Technologies Conference. But I think it also illustrates a very important point. If we can reprogram this machine to play Pac-Man, then someone malicious could certainly reprogram it to steal votes.